All right. It is morning in Colorado. I am caffeined up. I have taken a glorious morning shite, and now it's time to read some English Renaissance poetry, babies. Our text for today comes from the Oxford Shakespeare. We will be reading, or I will be reading rather, the most famous passage from all of William Shakespeare's plays, Hamlet's To Be or Not to Be Soliloquy. I'm going to read the soliloquy. I'm going to talk about it a little bit in a rather basic way. I'm not going to get into any Demonian deconstruction of Shakespeare here this early in the morning. I'll just basically be paraphrasing it, putting Hamlet's words into my poor, plain language so that maybe you can understand what he's saying a little better. But first of all, I'm going to read the soliloquy. So allow me to get into character, which may take a while, given all the caffeine I've had this morning. Open my collar, give myself more of a Renaissance feel here. Open the Oxford Shakespeare with my Classical Metropolitan Museum of Art bookmark. And Hamlet, 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 Hamlet. Oh, you depressive Dane. Enter Prince Hamlet. Hamlet. Enter me, Prince Hamlet. To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep, no more. And by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to, 'tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would these fardels bear, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of? Thus conscience does make cowards of us all. And thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard their currents turn away and lose the name of action. Okay, so what did all that amazing poetry mean? Well, in the most minimal interpretation, you could say that it all means those first 6 words: to be or not to be. Should I live on or should I kill myself? Everything else Hamlet says in this soliloquy is in apposition to those opening words. Everything. The entire soliloquy is an expansion upon the idea, the question, to be or not to be. Should I live or should I die? When Hamlet says that is the question, that is the question. That is the matter of everything he will be saying for the next couple minutes. So expanding upon to be or not to be, he first asks whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them, which is itself a restatement in parallel, turning on the or again, of to be, meaning to suffer in the mind the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, which is all the crap of life, to suffer this in our minds, or not to be, to take arms against a sea of troubles, to put a knife to our throat and end that mind. And then Hamlet reflects about death and sleep. He says, to die, to sleep, no more, which means, as I read it, death is nothing more than a sleep. It's no more than a sleep. To die, to sleep, no more. Death is nothing more than sleep, so why should we be afraid of it? And he goes on, still trying to convince himself to take the second of his choices, not to be. He says, and by sleep to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to, 'tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To kill ourselves and end all of the crap, all of the suffering of this life, and I think after 2020 we all know about the suffering of life. I certainly do. Because I went through some serious shit in 2020. I experienced 3 retinal detachments in this eye that came very close to leaving me at least half blind for the rest of my life. But it looks like I'm going to be okay now. But 2020, fuck you again. I don't think I'm ever going to stop saying 2020, fuck you. The only good thing that happened in 2020 was the election of Joe Biden and the defeat of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, fuck you. 2020, fuck you. Back to Shakespeare. When he ends this with the phrase, "'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished," Shakespeare is being blasphemous. The devoutly signposts the blasphemy. But the reference here is to the final words of Christ on the cross. When he's dying, he says, well, in a Latin translation, consummatum est. It is accomplished. That's the consummation Christ devoutly wished. And Hamlet is placing himself on the cross, a cross that he has built with his own mind, perhaps, crucifying himself and saying, when I die, when I kill myself, I can also say consummatum est, because death is the consummation I most wish. Hamlet goes on, to die, to sleep, and then he repeats to sleep, but he repeats it with a difference, because his mind is changing. He says, to die, to sleep. Then comes the turn, and he says, to sleep, perchance, to dream. And when he thinks of the dream, his mind changes. And he interjects, "I." There's the rub. There's the problem. Because death, if we figure it as sleep, well, with sleep comes dream. And if sleep is eternal, dream might also be eternal. So when we kill ourselves, we might be opening ourselves up to an eternal nightmare. Aye, there's the rub. And Hamlet goes on expanding on this point. For in that sleep of death, that eternal sleep, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, what dreams may come after we've died, must give us pause. I always think of a weird pun when I come to that line, thinking, they must give us pause? Like a cat's paws? But no, it's pause. Must cause us to hesitate before we kill ourselves. The thought of that eternity of nightmare, the thought of hell, of the afterlife, the punishment for sin that's been ingrained into us if we grew up in a religious household or religious society from our earliest moments, is what gives us pause, causes us to hesitate before taking that final step and ending our lives. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life, by which Hamlet means the thought of the fear of what comes after death is what forces us to live so long through a calamitous life, or like a life that's 2020 forever. Think about that. Wow. And then Hamlet asks a very long question that contains a catalog of the calamities of a long life. He begins, "For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin?" Who would put up with all that crap? If he could just end it all by taking a bodkin, which is a small knife, and plunging it into his heart. Who would these fardels bear? Now, fardels is a word we don't use anymore, but in Shakespeare's time it meant burdens. Everyone in his audience at the Globe would probably have understood exactly what he was saying. Who would these fardels, burdens, bear? Who would grunt and sweat under a weary life, except for the fact of the dread of something after death? And then Shakespeare figures death in a beautiful metaphor as the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. Wonderful that he uses the word bourne in a metaphor for death. So Shakespeare's punning consciousness at work here. The undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. It's the dread of something after death that, Shakespeare writes, puzzles the will. Puzzles the will. This phrase is, of course, being written in London in the early 1600s by a man named Will. This might be Shakespeare sticking his head up out of the text and saying not only, yes, I, Will Shakespeare, wrote this, this is my signature on the text, in the text, but it's also Shakespeare saying, yes, it puzzles me too. It puzzles the will. and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. The will is puzzled. The will to death, the will to suicide, is caught in the labyrinth of thought, of fear of what might come after death, and it forces us to accept the devil we know rather than fly to the devils we don't know. The Dantean cartoon devils with pitchforks, perhaps. Shakespeare goes on. Thus conscience, by which he means the consciousness of this fact, that we don't know what comes after death, does make cowards of us all. The cowardice being the lack of courage to kill oneself. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, by which he means the resolution to kill oneself, the will to death, is sickened. It's made wan and pale by too much thinking about what might come later. Exactly what Hamlet is doing here. Hamlet is entirely self-conscious. He knows what he's doing at every moment in this play, and he reflects upon it. And he goes on, and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard. The regard would be the pale cast of thought that sicklies over the face of resolution. With this regard, their currents turn away and lose the name of action. We go on living because we are afraid of the consequences of the act of suicide. Life, Hamlet is saying, is an act of cowardice. This little soliloquy is Hamlet reflecting to himself upon himself, but also very much pointing at us. And if we are not somehow troubled by it, if we don't feel this as an indictment of ourselves and the lives we lead, then we're probably not listening closely enough to Shakespeare. Great poetry, huh? It reminds me of one of my favorite lines from Ralph Waldo Emerson. He says, "People want to be settled, but it is only to the extent that they are unsettled that there's any hope for them." The greatest art, and that soliloquy I just read is an example of some of the greatest art we will ever encounter, functions to unsettle us. Art, at its best, does not come to entertain. It comes to destroy. It comes to create space in which, ideally, we might change ourselves. Something to think about. Bye for now.